I'm Roy Idelson, president of the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence, which is Division 48 of the American Psychological Association. I don't yet know how many people are actually attending our webinar today, but well over 500 registered, which perhaps reflects not only the expertise of our speaker today, but also a recognition of the importance of our theme for this year, resisting oppression, pursuing justice. I'll keep my introduction brief to allow more time for the presentation and for your questions, which can be entered into the Q&A box. Time permitting, we'll get to as many questions as we can. Okay, so our speaker today is Johanna Ray Vollhardt. Johanna is an associate professor of psychology at Clark University, where she is affiliated with the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and with the Center for Race, Gender, and Area Studies. She received her PhD in social psychology with a concentration in the psychology of peace and violence from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She has served as vice president of the International Society for Political Psychology, and she is a co-founder and co-editor of the open access, not-for-profit Journal of Social and Political Psychology. Dr. Vollhardt's research focuses on the psychology of collective victimization and how this relates to different forms of resistance under violent, repressive conditions. In 2020, she published an Oxford University Press edited volume titled The Social Psychology of Collective Victimhood. And last year, she was co-editor of the OUP volume titled Resistance to Violence and Repression, Global Psychological Perspectives. The title of her talk today is The Psychology of Resistance in Violent and Repressive Contexts. And with that, I'll now disappear and turn things over to you, Johanna.
Thank you so much, Roy, for the introduction and also for inviting me. I'm very honored to present here and start the series. Let me see. Okay, now it should be good with the sharing. Yes, you can see all my slides. Great. So, as you said, the topic of my talk today is a very general overview on the psychology of resistance in violent and repressive contexts specifically. But to start with a general definition of what resistance actually means, which I think is important also to remind people of that definition anytime anyone has a reaction to it or sees it as glorifying something. All it means is action and opposition. And when we're specifically talking about contexts of violence, oppression, asymmetrical power relations, then this action and opposition is any action that aims to thwart, limit, or undermine the exercise of power of the oppressor over the oppressed. So we always need to keep that definition in mind and think about power relations and the degree to which an action is actually countering rather than sustaining power as a way to differentiate resistance from other forms of coping with violence, such as resilience, although there's oftentimes overlap. Now, despite this very broad and general, or maybe because of this very broad and general definition of resistance, there's still a prototype of what we think of when we think of resistance, and the prototype is quite similar, I would say, in society and in social psychological research. So if we do a Google image search, which I think is a good way to get at societal prototypes, we get these kinds of images. Mass scale mobilization, organized collective action, people out on the streets. And so that prototype that exists in society when we hear resistance is also what social psychology has focused on in our work on, and by our, I mean the field's work on resistance. So really the majority of social psychological research and research in political psychology and adjacent subdisciplines focus on collective action as the prototype of resistance. So we have, entire meta-analysis of studies on what motivates collective action. Many of them have also been conducted in more democratic contexts, although increasingly there's more attention to contexts of repression and violence and how collective action there functions as well. But really, most of what we know about resistance, at least in social and political psychology, it's a little bit different in clinical and counseling, tends to focus on this prototype of resistance as large-scale, organized, collective action. However, in that same review paper that I just showed, we outline that, of course, there are many other forms of resistance that are less commonly studied, but nonetheless very important. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the dimensions of resistance. So you don't see there forms of resistance like cultural resistance, for example, which is also important, but some of the dimensions of resistance that can be used to characterize the broad scope of what we're really talking about when we think about resistance to violence and oppression. So resistance can vary along these dimensions, and of course, they're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes they're combined. But what you see here in this graph is the ones that are highlighted in gray are, again, the ones that we tend to focus on more in research in the field. So, for example, collective, organized action that is also nonviolent and overt out on the streets in nature, but less so, for example, on covert forms of resistance, violent resistance, psychological resistance, or everyday forms of resistance. So there's a lot really that we don't get into in our work. And now, why is this important? Why does it matter? Why is it important to go beyond this prototype of resistance as overt collective action, which of course is a very important form as well? But what are we missing when we don't consider these other dimensions of resistance, especially in contexts of violence and repression? I would argue that there are at least 3 reasons why it is important to move beyond this prototype of overt collective action. So one is the observation that in contexts of long-standing oppression, or when people have been protesting for a long time without tangible results, this tactic may not be the preferred strategy. So people may get tired of it, may doubt its efficacy, may in fact develop a lower sense of efficacy of that particular tactic because they're not seeing the outcomes. And so there are a few examples of this. One is described here in the paper that colleagues and I published, I think almost a year ago, anyway, a few months ago, no, almost a year ago, spring 2024. Anyway, about the perceived efficacy of the Palestine solidarity protests, because there we saw across the globe large-scale, massive mobilization protests in London or New York of 300,000 people in London. I remember one such number. Across the globe, many large-scale protests for months on a scale that hasn't been seen before for Palestine solidarity protests, and yet these protests didn't really seem to make any dent or have any influence on the decisions of policymakers in the US, for example, politicians in the US. No ceasefire despite all those protests for such a long time. So one might doubt the efficacy of collective action when this occurs, when people have been protesting for a long time without tangible results. Similarly, in contexts of long-standing oppression that has been going on for decades or sometimes even longer, where protests and mass mobilization has also been tried as a tactic, but again, nothing really changes in the group's oppression. People might also doubt the effectiveness of that resistance tactic. This is captured in a quote by a Kurdish-Turkish participant in Germany from a chapter that I'll talk about in a moment, who said, "Streets are not enough. How far shall we walk? Walk, walk, so many kilometers. I do not believe this anymore." A second reason why it is not sufficient to focus on collective action, overt collective action only, is that in violent and repressive contexts, it is, of course, oftentimes not possible to simply be out on the street and protest without severe risks of violent backlash and repression of those movements. And so instead, then, in such contexts, we might see that more subtle and more covert forms of resistance are more likely, which can include, but is not limited to, what James Scott has called everyday resistance. And here I also include a paper by social psychologists, Rosales and Langhut, which I recommend that people check out, about the notion of everyday resistance and what we're missing if we don't study it in addition to organized, overt, collective action. A third reason then is also that if we only focus on overt collective action as the prototype when we study resistance, we might therefore miss many of these other forms of relevant action, and in result falsely conclude and write papers and talk about how oppressed groups lack efficacy and agency, or feel powerless, or are passively accepting their fate, internalizing their oppression, justifying the system, etc. These are all quotes or things that I've read in papers, and obviously all of these phenomena occur as well. But my point is simply that we might be overestimating the extent to which these processes occur because of our prototype of resistance as overt, organized, large-scale mass mobilization, collective action on the streets. When we see that's not happening, we might draw the false conclusion that resistance is not occurring. And even just based on the few examples I gave before, we know that that's not the case. And so that's pretty much the conclusion that we come to in this book, an edited volume that Roy mentioned in his introduction that came out last October, I think, on resistance in violent and repressive contexts in various parts of the globe. So in this book, here's the table of contents, just to give kind of a, I don't know how much of this you can actually read on the screen, but you can Google it and look it up there. But just to give a sense of the scope, so we had chapters from many different contexts, including Lebanon, Turkey, the Philippines, Sudan, the West Bank, where else? The Czech Republic and Poland under socialism. So Rwanda, many different cases across the globe, where social psychologists focused on particular aspects of resistance there. And basically, when we look across all of these chapters, we can see a few main points that kind of unites these very disparate contexts, conclusions that we can draw from looking across the chapters that we summarize a bit in our conclusion. So one is that repression generally does not actually suppress resistance, even though that is, of course, the intention of repression, is precisely to suppress, repress resistance. And there's a large literature on whether that's actually the case or not, and the empirical findings are always somewhat mixed. So with some studies showing that resistance does decrease under repression, and other studies showing that there's a backlash in the sense that it increases resistance, for example, through increased outrage over the repression. So that's what the empirical findings show, the somewhat mixed picture. But when we look kind of more holistically and drawing on many qualitative analysis as well, that are presented in these chapters from many different contexts, we see that overall, while specific forms of resistance might be repressed through repression of this resistance itself does not disappear. Instead, it is kind of forced into, or creatively evolves into other forms and tactics, or goes underground, becomes covert, etc. So these different strategies, as I mentioned before, can include symbolic resistance, cultural resistance, resistance that is focused on preserving dignity, and a variety of other forms, everyday resistance, etc., such that overall we get a picture of resistance as something that is very multifaceted and creative, and that is also dynamic and not linear. So there are phases where certain forms of resistance boil up to the surface and are more prevalent, such as times of uprisings, and then it calms down again, so to speak, but that doesn't mean that resistance disappears. In the meantime, there are other forms of resistance happening that are less visible to outside observers, but that will then inform and feed into these more overt phases. That's described in the book in two chapters, actually. The one by, let me go back here, the one by Orazani and Teimouri on the women life freedom movement in Iran, and then a chapter by Moss and El Ghizuli on the revolution in Sudan, this dynamic fluctuation and the relation between collective action, street protest, and other forms of resistance, such as everyday resistance, which are not mutually exclusive, but can inform each other, as in particular Orazani and Teimouri argue in their chapter. Another observation from a few different chapters in the book, especially the one by Ayanian et al., is how psychological processes that we typically study in social psychology as motivating collective action, such as efficacy, moral outrage, anger, etc., might differ to some extent under more repressive conditions. So we can't just impose and assume the same psychology, the same models that we have from these studies in more democratic or less risky contexts to repressive and violent, or more repressive and violent contexts, more overtly repressive contexts. And then a final point is that we also see a lot of intra-group variation. Group members are not homogeneous, obviously, in their views on resistance, which tactics should be chosen, what they themselves do, engage in, or support. There's quite a bit of diversity within groups, and obviously some contestation as well, and a lot of parallel resistance subgroups, perhaps, where people engage in different strategies. The book also emphasizes that the context of repression and violence is very important to consider, because that will shape the psychology, but also the specific tactics of resistance. And so now I want to give 3 examples of this from 3 different contexts, just very briefly zooming in. So one example of a context feature is, for example, the context of military occupation or settler colonialism, and the kind of surveillance that can occur, that does occur in these contexts, such as in the occupied Palestinian territories. So here, just to briefly show one example of a study that was actually, I don't know if you see this or if something is being covered by these bars, but it was published in Division 48's journal, Peace and Conflict Journal of Peace Psychology last year. So in this study, we looked at survey data from Palestinians in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, and then combined that with geospatially coded data looking at the proximity of where people lived to checkpoints and other kinds of what we call the geography of military occupation. So proximity to checkpoints, to the wall, to settlements. And then looked at how that relates to people's motivations to engage in resistance, and a few psychological processes that we assume to inform that, such as community cohesion and trust. And what we find is that in this case, indeed, the repression as operationalized by surveillance through this military occupation infrastructure was associated with less support for nonviolent resistance. So the closer people lived to these infrastructures of the military occupation, checkpoints, for example, the less likely they were to support and engage in nonviolent resistance, nonviolent collective action, I will say, specifically. And the underlying processes was through decreased community cohesion and lower expectations of solidarity with resistance, presumably due to fear of repression and the consequences because of this surveillance. So here we do have an example of how repression can actually reduce specific forms of resistance, in this case, overt collective action. Notably, though, other studies by almost the same author team in another paper that I list below found that this proximity to the military occupation infrastructure did not suppress support for violent resistance, only for nonviolent resistance. So there is a backlash effect that is counterproductive, even from the perspective of the occupiers, I would argue. It also, of course, doesn't suppress forms of resistance that we didn't assess in the study, such as, very important in the context of Palestine, the notion of sumut. And here I won't get into this, but I recommend a few papers on sumut by psychologists Leana Meari or Devin Atala. Hamat has one or two review papers. It's very interesting and important work. A second example of how context shapes preference for different resistance tactics comes from my PhD students' work on resistance in the context of Puerto Rico. So Carmen Marazzi led this paper. And here the context to note is that this is a context of long-standing colonial oppression, as well as repression of liberation movements that occurred in Puerto Rico through the US. Violent repression of liberation movements, and then these hundreds of years of colonialism of the island. And so in this study, this was an interview study with Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico, where we simply asked, among many other things, what people do to counter the special colonial or the special relationship they have with the US. And what we found here is that, again, people emphasized a variety of different tactics that go way beyond protests. And just to orient you a little bit to this figure, this is a figure from the paper itself where we summarize the themes that we identified. We also color-coded here whether people talk about resistance as something that they themselves do, so that's the white, or something that they see other people in their community doing, so descriptive resistance norms, that's the lighter gray, or something that they think should be done in the future, but that they're not actually currently seeing, and that's the darker gray. And so what you'll notice here is that protests is dark gray. So that's not something they see happening. Like, yes, there are many protests in Puerto Rico, but this was specifically about protests against, US colonialism, anything related to the colonial relationship. At least among our participants, this was their representation of what's happening or not happening. So while it was not dismissed as a tactic, and they did think maybe we should bring it back, it was very much emphasized that this would be in the future and not something they see in the present. But instead, there were a variety of other resistance tactics that either they themselves engaged in or they also saw community members engaging in. So, for example, psychological resistance, which Colin Leach and Andrew Livingston wrote a very nice paper about, which is essentially defining for yourself the meaning of your oppression as opposed to internalizing, what other people say about your group's disadvantage, as well as symbolic and cultural resistance. So these are two strategies more on the identity level, but then also several more material, perhaps, resistance strategies that, again, are less commonly studied in social psychology, although they are actually also forms of collective action, perhaps even such as prefigurative politics. So when people engage in small-scale change in their community, in their own lives that they want to see in the future, for example, community-based farming to counter everything that happens there with the import-exports through US colonial measures, or staying in Puerto Rico, not leaving, even though they could, based on the citizenship, despite hardship and struggle, in order to resist, for example, more US investors coming and buying up all the land by the beach. Critical consciousness raising through education was another strategy that people talked about a lot. So again, there's no just one particular resistance tactic that is preferred or chosen, and it's definitely not collective action in the way we study it in social psychology as street protest. And here the quote on the left is a participant quote that speaks to the importance of really paying attention to all of these smaller acts of resistance, not just the large-scale protests. So this participant says, those are things that one may think are stupid or small, but they are not. because when you live in a colony, what they want to do is erase your identity. Speaking Spanish was illegal, having a Puerto Rican flag was illegal, singing our anthem was illegal. So every act counts, and that's also the title of the paper, because it's such a crucial key point. And there's so many forms of resistance that it's amazing to watch. I look for it, etc. All right, and so coming back to the context, what is important to note here is that many of these forms of resistance, as we can see here in the overview, are of course in response to the specific context, the specific nature of oppression that has been going on for so and so many years or decades or centuries. Whereas, so these are forms of resistance that we might see in those contexts of longstanding oppression. Whereas if there's a shorter term grievance, something that comes up like suddenly, suddenly something is imposed on a population, some kind of unjust rule or fees, that was a trigger for many protests, right? There we might see protest as a tactic, but in this context of longstanding oppression over centuries, other strategies are necessary and common. And that is pretty much also the conclusion of a study that was conducted by another doctoral student of mine, Helene Unal, who has now long graduated and is the SPICI Policy Fellow in DC right now. She studied resistance among Kurds from Turkey in the diaspora, which again is a context of longstanding ethnic persecution over decades or centuries, one where there has been armed conflict, intense restrictions of cultural autonomy, for example, banning Kurdish language, or even certain letters associated with the Kurdish language in Turkey, etc. So in this context, she and colleagues of hers studied, again, simply through qualitative methods, what people actually say they are doing and which resistance strategies they prefer. And so just to briefly show some of the themes, we see a lot of overlap with actually the Puerto Rican findings as well, a little bit different because of, again, the different context. But, we do see, for example, again, cultural resistance showing up, or the importance of consciousness raising. Participants also discussed protests, as I mentioned before, oftentimes a little bit critically, given how long they have been trying that. And in this context of armed conflict, obviously, they also discuss armed resistance, which was absent from the other findings, as well as gender-based resistance based on the importance of gender in the Kurdish resistance movement and the PKK. What was very notable in the findings was the variation in endorsement of these different tactics and disagreements, and people also articulating and talking about how they disagree, for example, with protest as an effective strategy. So there is very much a sense that there are multiple resistance tactics that the group members use. And one of the themes was, in fact, the need for these different methods of resistance simultaneously in order to try different tactics and use them at the same time. But also the recognition that this brings with it some potential for fragmentation that has to be overcome. For example, ideological differences and differences in tactics in support for different resistance tactics in order to put them aside or be more tolerant of these other ideologies around resistance in order to unite in order to bring about national liberation. All right, so this variety of different resistance tactics, of course, for psychologists then immediately raises the question, what explains who in the group favors which tactics? And of course, a common approach by psychologists might be to look at individual difference variables in ideology and identity and so on. But arguably, in this context of repression and violence, we also need to look more closely at the specific context as well. And what is interesting, I think, also is to think about how, despite this really limitation of agency in many ways, or the possibilities for people to act in conditions of extreme violence and repression, we still see considerable variation in how people resist against this violence and the oppression. And so I want to talk about this a little bit more in the context of a study I conducted with my colleague Michal Bielewicz at Warsaw University on Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. And this is also a chapter that's published in the book mentioned earlier. So here what we were interested in, as the title says, is the difference in what helps explain when and why, or who the people were who chose collective resistance strategies. And I'll talk a bit more about what that meant and looked like in this context, as opposed to focusing on individual resistance strategies, and if we can find any kind of patterns that help explain the difference. Now, first, just to note that this is, again, resistance during the Holocaust or in any genocide, really, is also a domain where the prototype of resistance has led to the perception that there wasn't enough resistance, right? There's this famous quote about Jews going like sheep to the slaughter, or, asking in early years after the Holocaust why Jews didn't resist more, which is really a misconception. So it's Einwohner, Rachel Einwohner, a sociologist, has some really excellent work and a book on this topic, discussing how this is a real myth, that Jews were passive during the Holocaust and just, accepted their fate. So one point she makes is that collective organized Jewish resistance was actually much more common than we may think. We only have the prototype of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but she describes how, in fact, there were underground organizations in 52 ghettos. There were armed uprisings in 5 concentration camps and 18 forced labor camps. There were 30,000 Jewish partisans who fought in the forests of Eastern Europe. And of course, Jews were also part of many resistance groups in other countries and outside of the ghettos, and also non-Jewish resistance groups as well. In addition to that, there were many cases of uprisings that were planned but were not successful, that we simply therefore don't know much about in history. So what they call missed resistance, for example. Another factor that contributes to this myth of passivity during the Holocaust is that people tend to underestimate the role of these external conditions on our ability to engage in organized, overt resistance. So of course, any kind of overt resistance was violently oppressed immediately with executions, not just of the resistance fighters or members of the group themselves, but oftentimes, the entire block, for example, in the ghetto. So there was, of course, this extreme risk. But in addition to that, when we just think about the conditions, there was severe restriction of movement, obviously, which reduces the ability to organize. There was starvation, extreme physical weakness. I mean, I can't even answer an email when I have a headache. How are we expecting people who are starving to plan these complex, risky forms of resistance under these conditions? There was other forms of resource constraints. For example, many survivors talk about the lack of weapons, the ability to obtain access to things they needed for armed resistance, which might lead us to the false conclusion that people didn't want to engage in armed resistance, where actually oftentimes it was the lack of availability of weapons, for example, in part also due to lack of solidarity from non-Jewish partisans or people they tried to obtain weapons from. So many different external reasons that would have reduced the kind of resistance that we think of when we think of resistance in contexts of genocide, such as armed uprisings. But of course, that's not the only thing that people did. And so we thought it was important to also look at acts of individual resistance, which was any act that aimed to undermine Nazis' destructive power over a particular Jewish person. And we're taking here the definition of resistance, right, to ensure that it maps on. Because one argument is, well, is this resistance or is it resilience? If it's just, an individual who's trying to survive and hide and save their life. Can that be called resistance? And we argue yes, because if the definition of resistance is that it is any act that aims to undermine the oppressor's will and power, and in this context of genocide, their will is to annihilate and destroy Jews, among other people, and exert this destructive power over them, then of course anything that avoids that act of killing is an act of resistance in this context, right? So hiding, passing as non-Jewish to survive, escaping deportation, smuggling food, but also engaging in spiritual resistance and other forms of resistance, work slowdowns. These were all the kinds of things that we coded and examined as forms of individual resistance. And then to compare it with the group of people who engaged in more collective forms of resistance. And of course, the two are not mutually exclusive. So people who engaged in collective resistance, of course, also engaged in individual acts of resistance. But these would be the things that we may think of more prototypically, kind of the organized ghetto underground groups, for example, or partisans in the forest, but also things like coordinated rescue actions, coordinated actions to smuggle food, to get, papers for people to pass as non-Jewish, as well as underground cultural groups in the ghettos, things that were forbidden in that context to preserve Jewish culture. All right, so our question then for this study was what explains the choice between people who engaged in individual acts of resistance versus people who also engaged in collective acts of resistance during the Holocaust. Can we find any individual differences or context factors that help explain why people chose, or who these people were who chose either way to resist in this context of extreme violence and oppression? The way we studied it was by using oral history testimonies from the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. So this is an amazing database. Anyone who doesn't know it yet should check it out. It's online. Many of the testimonies are available to anyone, and it includes testimonies not just from the Holocaust, but also from several other genocides, contexts of mass atrocities. The Holocaust survivor testimonies were recorded in the mid-90s. There are 52,000 of them from many different countries and many different languages. And these are basically life story interviews of survivors before, during, and after the Holocaust. So our research design was that we sampled 200 of these survivor testimonies, 100 of which were from survivors who engaged in collective resistance of various kinds. Then we matched them with a comparison group of survivors who were matched in terms of age, gender, and place of birth, country of birth, but who engaged in individual only, so to speak, in individual resistance during the Holocaust. We made sure that people were, of somewhat of age by the time that they were not children during the Holocaust, but teenagers at least. So they were on average 17 when the war began. What we did then was we content analyzed and coded these testimonies for a few different factors that, based on the literature, we would expect to perhaps explain the differences, but also, exploring a variety of other factors. And I'll just highlight a few differences that we found between these groups, as well as some things that we didn't find, although one might expect to. So one is in terms of personal values and ideology, which is an explanation that might be favored in social psychology, where we look for ideology and individual motivations of those kinds as predictors of resistance. And here we find that survivors who had engaged in collective resistance during the Holocaust were more likely to have been leftists before the war, and also more likely to have been politically active before the war and report more universalist values compared to survivors who engaged primarily or only in individual resistance strategies. What we didn't find is differences between these two groups in terms of various factors that may indicate different forms of in-group identity or politicized identity. For example, whether they were Zionist or not, how religious they were, how assimilated they were. There were no significant differences between these two groups in those factors. We also looked at people's social network and factors related to the family, and found that this seemed to matter quite a bit. So survivors who engaged in collective resistance were more likely than survivors engaged in individual resistance to have family role models of resistance, so other relatives who were already involved in resistance movements, like a sibling or sometimes even parents. Sometimes this was before the war, but mostly during the war. They were also less likely to have family responsibilities during that period, which usually meant this was either, caretaking for a parent or a child, usually a parent given their age. What this unfortunately often meant was that they had lost their relatives. Their relatives were killed, deported, and then it was oftentimes after they lost the responsibility for their family members that they became more involved in collective movements. Whereas people involved in individual resistance strategies, such as smuggling food, were more for themselves, and their families were more likely to have these responsibilities for other family members. We did not, however, find any significant differences in, for example, whether the family had certain political ideologies or reported more pro-social values, were religious or not, place of residence. All of that did not differ between the two groups. What did, however, differ, kind of related to the previous point I also mentioned, was survivors' personal experiences of violence, what specifically they lived through during the Holocaust and where they were located. So people involved in collective resistance were more likely to be in a ghetto. They were more likely to have witnessed killings, mass killings, and they were more likely to have lost a family member traumatically through deportation, killing, etc., compared to people involved in individual resistance strategies. Whereas people who used individual resistance strategies were more likely to be in a concentration camp compared to those engaged in collective resistance. A final finding is that we looked into several factors that social identity theory would perhaps refer to as permeability. So there, the theory is that if you can leave your group, if the group boundaries are somewhat permeable and you can exit that group and improve your condition individually rather than collectively, you will be less likely to engage in collective action. That's kind of classic social identity theory, collective action predictions. So we tested a few factors like that, such as whether people were able to pass as non-Jewish, whether they had wealth and means to escape, to bribe someone to get them papers, things like that, whether they had outgroup members who were helping them to survive, whether they had comparatively privileged positions working for Nazis in some special role, which made it more likely that they would survive. And we didn't find any significant differences in that, and the qualitative between the two resistance groups. And the qualitative data actually shows that people would oftentimes use their what might serve as individual permeability resources, such as ability to pass as non-Jewish or having wealth, for collective resistance. So, for example, serving as runners for ghetto underground movement, because they could move more easily in and out of the ghetto and pass as non-Jewish on the other side, and then smuggle resources, weapons, etc., back into the ghetto. There are many famous cases like that. All right, so to summarize a few key points, not just from this study, but overall, all of the examples that I've showed you, we see that people resist in numerous ways, even under the most violent and most repressive contexts that severely constrain what people are able to do. In fact, rather than repressing resistance in these contexts, tactics might become more varied, more creative in a way because of the need to adapt. The context of violence and repression, and in general, the context matters and shapes choices of resistance tactics to respond to specific forms of violence and oppression, and also to evade specific forms of repression. So again, this speaks to the creativity. People creatively invent forms of resistance that will also help them avoid the worst, or hopefully avoid the worst of the repression. But despite this role of context, there is also very important variation within groups. There are individual differences in regard to which resistance tactics are preferred or chosen by different people, which, however, might not be as much driven by personality and ideology and other individual differences that social psychologists like to study, but also particularly in these very repressive contexts by context factors such as exposure to social networks, to norms, to people around you who are already involved in certain resistance strategies, groups, etc. So we need to pay more attention to that. Now, finally, in the last 5 minutes or so of the talk, so that we have a little bit of time for questions, I just want to end on a brief reflection of our role as scholars to support and engage in resistance to violence and repression within academia and from our position and responsibility as scholars. Now, this is not about what we can do in our private lives to join various activist groups, be involved in social movements, etc. Obviously, we can do all of that as well, and we should. But I'm talking now specifically about our role as scholars and our positionality as academics. And here I think the Division 48 President Roy Idelson is an excellent example of how one can do that and should do that, and has given us many inspiring examples of that as well. But the ones I want to just briefly show are very different context, but it's all related and connected. So one is a group that I'm involved with, Scientist Rebellion, which is a civil disobedience group. So here, when we think about repression, the interesting twist is that civil disobedience, nonviolent direct action, uses, of course, anticipated repression strategically in some way. To gain more attention, to get people outraged and in support of the movement. And so Scientist Rebellion is a climate activist group of academics and researchers. You don't need to be a natural scientist in order to participate, but we use, among many other things that we do, we use civil disobedience to participate in resistance against the destruction of the earth. This is a protest in front of or a blockade of the Citibank headquarters, the largest funders of fossil fuel projects. So if you're interested in Scientist Rebellion, please check us out. Here's the link to the website. Everyone is welcome, not just natural scientists. A second example is the resistance that has been organized by academics and scholars in the context of Gaza or Palestine more broadly. So here are just two organizations I want to highlight. Again, these are academics organizing as academics. So there's Faculty for Justice in Palestine. There's Scholars Against the War on Palestine. And this is an example of resistance to violence and repression that is also heavily targeted by repression. And then in relation to that, we see now a lot more, increasingly more, organizing by the American Association of University Professors, AAUP. Every academic can join as an individual. There are more and more chapters on various campuses that have been speaking out and organizing against academic repression in the context of Palestine solidarity work, but also many other contexts, and organizing to maintain our academic freedom, which of course is becoming increasingly more important and more of a problem for us. So this is a recent, and by us I mean all of us, regardless where you stand on these issues, many issues are under attack. This is a recent report or statement by AUP against anticipatory obedience in academia and universities, urging us simply to organize more collectively against the repression and for academic freedom. So these are just some ideas. Of course, there are many other excellent groups that we can all join. Just find one that fits your main purpose or focus and the tactics that you personally prefer, I would say, as an appeal, and start organizing. And the final slide, this is linked to the book that I showed you before. We also organize a virtual meeting series on the psychology of resistance in violent and repressive contexts. So here's our website. If you go to that website, you can sign up for our mailing lists and get the emails for all the upcoming sessions that are listed here. Right now, we do once a month, and there are recordings of previous sessions on that website as well. All right, so thank you so much for your attention, and here's my information in case you want any of the papers I mentioned, and this is where you can find me on social media. And that's all. 10 more minutes, I think, for questions.
Great. Thank you, Johanna. That was terrific. A lot of information there. We have a few questions that have been posted. If you want to ask a question, please type it in. Here is one. When talking about group members disagreeing on resistance tactics, do we find that the differing preferences are helpful, as in we need all sorts to survive, or hurtful, as in they are working against each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can actually be a little bit of both, but I would much more heavily weigh on the first possibility, which is that we need multiple tactics and they also mutually support and inform each other rather than undermining each other. This is not just my personal opinion, but we can use research, for example, on the radical flank effect to support this. So the radical flank effect is research on how the presence of a more radical flank within the same movement. So, for example, groups that use more disruptive tactics or even violent tactics can actually help garner more support and sympathy for the more moderate flanks within the same movement. In part because people look at the two, and by contrast, then all of a sudden the moderate flank that may have been dismissed as crazy or unreasonable will suddenly seem more reasonable in compared to that radical flank. But in addition to that effect, there are also simply just so many different goals and audiences to target, and oppression and violence is multifaceted, right? We see this in the example of resistance against colonial oppression, for example, in Puerto Rico. Part of, right, it's economic, it's cultural, it's political. There are so many different facets to it, not all of which can be targeted or resisted through the same tactics. So I think that's another reason why we need multiple tactics to get at different aspects, facets of the oppression, and also again to speak to different audiences and just kind of, yeah, mobilize more people, get more people drawn in and involved across, different preferences, abilities, sensibilities. Some people have visceral reactions to some forms of resistance and others to others, right? So yes, it's all necessary in most cases.
Great, thank you. Here's another. This might take more time than we have. How do you see the most effective kinds or combination of kinds of resistance to the current oppressive authoritarian regime in the United States?
I'm not sure I fully or know what I can say there. So is the question, what would the best types be? What would the best
I
ingredients in
think
the
so.
pot be?
That's what I interpret the question to mean.
I mean, it's so hard to know what will actually be effective, right? That is part of the problem, and that speaks again to, I think, also the last question, right? We need to experiment. I mean, this is something that many movement organizers say. Kelly Hayes, for example, or Mariam Kaba, abolitionist organizers, right? We just need to try out all of the different tactics and see what sticks, what's effective. It's oftentimes impossible to predict it, I would say. I mean, we can try to draw on past examples and see what was effective, and that's, the civil disobedience movements that I work with in the climate world. Of course, we look at, past civil disobedience, mass mobilization, in the civil rights movement, et cetera, and see, okay, that was effective there, so that means it should be effective here as well. But context changes, and so I think it's really impossible to predict and know what will be effective.
Thank you. How does empathy for the oppressors influence resistance strategies?
That's an interesting question that I, to be honest, have not thought a lot about. Empathy for the oppressors. I mean, the only thing I can remember from some of my studies, again with the Holocaust resistance examples, was how some of the people who were involved in these armed resistance groups really had moral qualms about killing, even in this context, whereas others were had very strong feelings about the need for revenge and kind of the cathartic almost effect it had, which reminds of Frantz Fanon. So that's maybe the only place where I have come across empathy, that it could perhaps a little bit influence violent versus nonviolent resistance tactics in some cases, although not always. But yeah, I haven't thought much about that.
Thank you. Let's go with one more, although there are several. Is there any research on the impact of repressor infiltration of resistance?
Mm. I'm not aware of any research. I mean, not psychological research. I'm very aware of historical examples of, for example, the role of, the FBI infiltrating the Black Power movement and how that fragmented and in some cases led to conflict within the movement. So, I mean, yeah, it can be effective in creating conflict, mistrust. Any group I'm part of, that uses civil disobedience in particular, but in general is very aware of the potential for infiltration, which gives rise to some mistrust when you're not quite sure about some members in the group, right? So that would be an obvious influence. But I'm not aware of research on the topic in sociology or social psychology. It's interesting, though. I'll look for it.
Great. Thank you. Again, I just want to thank you, Johanna. It was a wonderful presentation, a great way for us to start this series. We really appreciate it and everything you do in support of peace and justice, in other arenas. Also want to thank everyone who attended today. We're hoping to host a webinar every month on topics related to resisting oppression and pursuing justice. Pleased to announce that next month, on March 3rd at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, our speakers will be Francesca Albanese and Gabor Mate, and the title of their talk will be "We Must Not Look Away, Confronting the Atrocities Against Palestinian Lives." If you're a member of our society, Division 48, you'll be receiving an email announcement with registration information soon. If you're not a member, we would, of course, love to have you join us. And you do not have to be a member of APA in order to be a member of our society. You can join immediately or anytime online at peacepsychology.org. So again, thanks, Johanna. Thanks, everyone. And goodbye and peace for now.
And thank you, Roy, for initiating this. And also, as I said before, for all the examples you give. And anyone who doesn't know the work you do, please check out Roy's websites and social media for examples of what else we can do in academia and beyond.
Thanks so much. Be well.
Thank you.